Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over 13 years, and he thought he had developed an immunity to being caught off guard. He had heard thousands of stories, witnessed countless emotional moments, and learned to navigate even the most unexpected revelations with grace and humor. But on a crisp October afternoon in 2024, a 29-year-old Marine named Captain Jake Morrison was about to reveal something so shocking, so heartbreaking, and so profound that it would cause Steve Harvey to immediately stop all production, call for the cameras to cut, and demand that everyone in the studio give this young man the space to share a truth that had been destroying him from the inside. What started as a routine question about his military service would unravel into a confession about a promise made, a tragedy witnessed, and a burden carried for 7 years that nobody knew about except the men who were there. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these moments that reveal the hidden costs of service and sacrifice. The Morrison family stood on the Family Feud stage with the kind of discipline and composure you'd expect from a military family. Captain Jake Morrison, 29 years old, stood tall in his marine dress blues, his posture perfect, his face composed but his eyes carrying shadows that spoke of things he'd seen and couldn't forget. Beside him stood his wife, Rachel, 28 years old, whose hand gripped his with a tightness that suggested she was holding him together as much as supporting him. Jake's younger brother, Matt, age 26, also in uniform, stood next to their father, retired Colonel David Morrison, age 58, whose chest full of medals told its own story of a life spent in service. Jake's mother, Susan, age 56, completed their 5-person team. They were competing against the Torres family from California, and the game had been progressing with the usual mix of competition and camaraderie. But there was something about Jake Morrison that Steve Harvey kept noticing. The young Marine answered questions when called upon, smiled when appropriate, but there was a distance in his eyes, like part of him was somewhere else entirely. During the commercial breaks, while other families relaxed and joked around, Jake stood at attention, his jaw clenched, his breathing carefully controlled like he was managing something internal that threatened to overwhelm him. During a break between rounds, Steve walked over to the Morrison family, drawn by his instinct that there was a story here that needed to be heard. Morrison family, serving our country with the Marines. That's something to be proud of. Jake, I can see you're a captain. That's impressive for someone so young. How long have you been serving? Jake's response was measured, controlled. 8 years, Mr. Harvey. I enlisted right out of high school, went to officer candidate school, served 3 tours overseas. 3 tours. Steve repeated, his voice carrying respect. That's significant service, young man. Where were you deployed? Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Afghanistan, sir. All 3 tours were in Afghanistan. Rachel, his wife, squeezed his hand harder. Matt, his brother, shifted his weight uncomfortably. Their father, the colonel, had gone very still, his face betraying nothing but his eyes showing concern for his son. Steve, ever perceptive, noticed the tension. Jake, you okay, man? You look like you're carrying something heavy. For a moment, Jake's military composure wavered. His eyes glistened with tears he was fighting desperately to hold back. When he spoke, his voice was tight. Mr. Harvey, I need to tell you something. Something that happened before my last deployment. Something I haven't talked about publicly, but I think I need to. Steve's demeanor immediately shifted from entertainer to concerned listener. He glanced at the producers. Hold on, stop everything. Jake, whatever you need to say, you take your time. We're not going anywhere. The studio went quiet. The audience sensed something important was about to happen. Jake took several deep breaths, the kind of controlled breathing you learn in combat situations to manage stress and fear. Rachel stood closer to him, her other hand now on his back, supporting him. 7 years ago, Jake began, his voice shaking despite his efforts to control it. I was preparing for my second deployment to Afghanistan. I was 22 years old, newly married to Rachel, and I had just been promoted to lieutenant. We were scheduled to deploy in 2 weeks. He paused, his throat working. 3 weeks before deployment, my best friend from high school, a guy named Tommy Chen, called me. Tommy wasn't military. He was a teacher, working at an elementary school in our hometown. We'd grown up together, Been best friends since we were 8 years old. We were like brothers." Steve was listening intently, his full focus on Jake. The young Marine continued, tears now visibly forming. "Tommy told me he needed to talk to me about something important. He sounded strange on the phone, off somehow, but I was busy with pre-deployment training, and I told him we'd catch up when I had more time. I told him I'd call him in a few days." Jake's voice broke completely. "I never made that call." Rachel was crying silently beside him. Matt had moved closer to his brother. The colonel's face had crumpled with emotion he could no longer hide. "4 days before my deployment," Jake continued, forcing the words out through his tears, "I got a call from Tommy's sister. Tommy had died by suicide. He had hanged himself in his apartment, and he left a note." The studio was absolutely silent. Steve Harvey's face showed pure devastation. He reached out and put his hand on Jake's shoulder. The note said a lot of things. Jake's voice was barely a whisper now. It talked about his depression, about struggles he'd been having, about feeling alone and hopeless. But the last line, the very last thing Tommy wrote before he took his own life, was, "I tried to reach out to Jake but he was too busy. I understand. Tell him I love him and I'm sorry." Jake completely broke down, his military bearing shattering as he sobbed. "He called me because he needed help and I was too busy. I was his best friend and he reached out and I told him I'd call him later and I never did. And now he's dead and it's my fault." Steve Harvey stood there with tears streaming down his face, his hand still on Jake's shoulder. Rachel wrapped her arms around her husband, holding him as he fell apart. Matt was crying openly. Susan Morrison had her hand over her mouth, sobbing. Even the colonel, this decorated military officer who had trained himself to maintain composure in any situation, was openly weeping. Steve's voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. "Jake, son, I need you to listen to me. Are you listening?" Jake nodded, unable to speak. "What happened to Tommy was not your fault. You hear me? It was not your fault." "But I should have known," Jake cried out. "I should have heard in his voice that something was wrong. I should have made time. I should have called him back. I should have." "Stop," Steve said firmly. "Jakey, I need you to stop. You were 22 years old, preparing to deploy to a war zone. You had 1,000 things on your mind. You had no way of knowing that Tommy was in crisis. You had no way of knowing that phone call was a cry for help. You cannot blame yourself for not being able to read someone's mind." Jake shook his head violently. "But that's what makes it worse, Mr. Harvey. I did know something was wrong. I heard it in his voice. I knew Tommy well enough to know he sounded off. But I was so wrapped up in my own life, in my deployment, in my career, that I ignored my instincts. I chose to believe it could wait when deep down I knew it couldn't." Steve's face showed that he understood this was more complicated than simple reassurance could fix. "What happened after you found out?" Jake wiped his face roughly. "I deployed anyway. I had to. The Marines don't stop because you're grieving. I went to Afghanistan carrying the guilt of Tommy's death with me. And then, 2 months into my deployment, something happened that I've never told anyone except Rachel and my therapist." Rachel gripped his hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Steve leaned in, giving Jake his full attention. "We were on patrol in Helmand Province." Jake's voice had gone flat, the emotional tone replaced by the detached delivery of someone reporting facts they can't afford to feel. "We got ambushed. Heavy fire from 3 directions. My squad was pinned down. One of my Marines, a kid named Private Rodriguez, he was 19 years old, he got hit. The bullet went through his leg, severed his femoral artery. He was bleeding out." Jake's hands were shaking now. "I was the closest to him. I applied a tourniquet, tried to stop the bleeding, called for medevac. But Rodriguez, he knew he was dying. And as he laid there in the dirt, bleeding out, he looked at me and said, 'Sir, I need you to call my mom. Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm sorry I won't be there for my little sister's Quinceañera era like I promised.'" Tears were streaming down Jake's face again, and I promised him. I looked this 19-year-old kid in the eyes and I said, "You're going to tell her yourself, Rodriguez. You're going to be fine." But he wasn't fine. He died in that dirt road before the medevac could get there. He died asking me to make a phone call, and I lied to him. I told him he'd be fine when I knew he was dying. Steve Harvey had sat down on the edge of the stage, unable to stand anymore. The weight of what Jake was sharing was too heavy for anyone to remain standing. After Rodriguez died, Jake continued, his voice breaking again, all I could think about was Tommy, about how Rodriguez asked me to make a call for him and I promised, the same way Tommy asked me to make time for him and I promised, and I realized that I failed them both. I failed Tommy by not calling him back, and I failed Rodriguez by lying to him in his final moments instead of giving him the truth he deserved. He looked directly at Steve, his eyes full of anguish. For 7 years, I've been carrying both of them with me. Tommy, whose call I didn't return, Rodriguez, who I lied to as he died. And I can't escape them, Mr. Harvey. I see Rodriguez's face every time I close my eyes. I hear Tommy's voice in my head asking if we can talk, and I don't know how to forgive myself for either of them. Steve Harvey was openly sobbing, his shoulders shaking. He took several minutes before he could speak. Jake, did you call Rodriguez's mother? Jake nodded. I did. 3 days after he died, I called her from a satellite phone in Afghanistan. I told her that her son died a hero, that he was brave, that his last thoughts were of her and his sister. I told her everything except that I had lied to him in his final moments. And Tommy's family? Steve asked gently. I went to see them when I got back from deployment. I apologized for not calling Tommy back. His sister told me that Tommy had struggled with depression for years, that he had made previous attempts, that it wasn't my fault. But I couldn't accept that. I still can't. Matt, Jake's brother, spoke up for the first time. Steve, I need to tell you something about my brother that he won't tell you himself. After that deployment, Jake came home different. He was diagnosed with PTSD and survivor's guilt. He's been in therapy for 6 years. He has nightmares every night. He wakes up screaming Tommy's name or Rodriguez's name, and despite all of this, he went back. He did a 3rd tour because he felt like he owed it to Rodriguez to keep serving. Rachel added, her voice thick with tears. Jake tortures himself every single day. He thinks he's weak for having PTSD, for not being able to just get over it. He thinks he doesn't deserve happiness or peace because Tommy and Rodriguez don't have those things. He lives like he's punishing himself for surviving when they didn't. Colonel Morrison, Jake's father, finally spoke. His voice was heavy with emotion but also with authority earned through decades of military service. Mr. Harvey, I'm a career Marine. I've served in 3 wars. I've lost men under my command. I understand combat trauma and survivor's guilt. But watching my son carry this burden, watching him destroy himself with guilt over things he couldn't control, that's been the hardest thing I've ever experienced. He looked at his son with such love and pain. Jake is one of the best officers I've ever known. His men would follow him anywhere because he cares about them, because he puts their welfare above his own, because he leads with integrity. But he can't extend the same compassion to himself that he shows to everyone else. Steve Harvey stood back up, walked over to Jake, and took both of the young Marine's hands in his own. Jake, I'm going to tell you some hard truths, and I need you to really hear me. Can you do that? Jake nodded, tears still streaming down his face. First truth, Tommy's death was not your fault. Not even a little bit. You were not responsible for his mental health. You did not cause his depression. You did not make him take his own life. Tommy was struggling with something bigger than one phone call, and as much as you wish you could have saved him, the reality is that you couldn't have known he was in immediate danger. Steve's voice grew firmer. Second truth, Rodriguez's death was not your fault either. You didn't shoot him. You didn't put him in that situation. You were a Marine doing your job in a war zone, and when he was dying, you did exactly what he needed in that moment. You gave him hope. You gave him comfort. You lied to him not because you're a bad person, but because you're a compassionate one who couldn't bear to watch a 19-year-old kid lose hope in his final moments. He continued, you think you failed Rodriguez by lying to him. But Jake, what was the alternative? Tell a dying teenager that he's not going to make it. Let him spend his last moments in terror instead of hope. You made a split-second decision to give a dying man peace instead of panic. That's not failure, that's mercy. Jake was sobbing, but Steve pressed on. Third truth, survivor's guilt is lying to you. It's telling you that you don't deserve to be alive because Tommy and Rodriguez aren't. It's telling you that happiness is betrayal, that peace is disrespect, that moving forward is abandoning them. But that's not true. Tommy would want you to live. Rodriguez would want you to live. They wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for surviving. Steve turned to address the audience and cameras. How many of you out there are carrying guilt for things you couldn't control? How many of you are punishing yourselves for not being able to read minds, for not being able to save someone, for surviving when someone else didn't? Because I'll tell you right now, that guilt is lying to you too. He looked back at Jake. You served your country with honor. You led your men with integrity. You cared enough about Rodriguez to stay with him as he died instead of taking cover. You cared enough about Tommy to carry the weight of his death for 7 years. That's not weakness. That's love. But son, you've got to let yourself heal. You've got to forgive yourself for being human, for not being able to save everyone, for surviving. Jake's voice was broken when he spoke. How? How do I forgive myself when they're dead and I'm alive? How do I move forward when I know that if I had just made different choices, they might still be here? Steve's response was gentle but firm. You don't know that. You can't know that. Tommy struggled with depression for years before that phone call. If you had called him back that day, maybe it would have delayed the inevitable, or maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. You don't know, and Rodriguez was in a war zone where people die. You applied a tourniquet, you called for help, you stayed with him. You did everything you could. His death wasn't because you failed. It was because war is brutal and random and unfair. He continued. You move forward by honoring them through how you live. You honor Tommy by being there for other people who are struggling, by recognizing the signs of someone in crisis, by never being too busy again. You honor Rodriguez by continuing to serve, by taking care of your Marines, by being the kind of leader who stays with his men even in the worst moments. You don't honor them by destroying yourself. Rachel spoke up, her voice shaking. Jake, Steve is right. Tommy and Rodriguez are gone, and that's a tragedy. But you're still here. I'm still here. Your family is here. And we need you. Not the version of you that's punishing himself every day, but the real you. The man I married. The brother Matt looks up to. The son your parents are proud of. That man is still in there, but he's drowning in guilt that isn't his to carry. Matt added, Bro, I joined the Marines because of you. You inspired me. But watching you suffer like this for 7 years, that's been hell. I want my brother back, not the perfect hero who never makes mistakes, but my actual brother who's human and imperfect and doing the best he can. Colonel Morrison spoke with the authority of a father and a fellow warrior. Son, I've lost men. I've made decisions in combat that resulted in deaths. I've carried guilt for things I couldn't control. And I can tell you from experience that at some point, you have to choose. You can let the guilt destroy you, or you can channel it into something meaningful. You can't bring Tommy or Rodriguez back, but you can use what happened to become a better officer, a better friend, a better husband. That's how you honor the dead. Steve made a decision. We're stopping this game. I don't care about Family Feud right now. Jake needs help, and we're going to get it for him. He pulled out his phone and made a call right there on stage. I need you to connect me with the best PTSD and trauma therapist you can find, someone who specializes in combat veterans and survivors' guilt. Yes, I'm serious. I need someone who can work with a young Marine who's been carrying trauma for 7 years. He hung up and looked at Jake. The Steve Harvey Foundation is covering your therapy as much as you need for as long as you need it. You're going to work with specialists who understand combat trauma. You're going to get the help you deserve. He continued, and we're also going to connect you with organizations that work with veterans and with suicide prevention. Because Jake, your story, as painful as it is, could save lives. There are other veterans out there carrying similar guilt. There are people who need to hear that they're not alone, that survivors' guilt is real but treatable, that they can heal. Steve turned to the audience. And for everyone watching, if you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, please reach out. Call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Talk to someone. Don't suffer in silence like Tommy did. And if you're a veteran struggling with PTSD or survivor's guilt, please get help. The VA has resources. There are organizations specifically for veterans. You don't have to carry this alone. He looked back at Jake. You carried Tommy and Rodriguez for 7 years. Now let us help carry you for a while. Let us support you while you heal, because you deserve healing, Jake. You deserve peace. You deserve to live without this crushing weight. Jake Morrison, this decorated Marine who had maintained perfect military bearing through 3 combat tours, completely broke down in Steve Harvey's arms. He sobbed like a child, all the grief and guilt and pain of 7 years pouring out of him in front of millions of viewers. And Steve just held him, this young warrior who had given so much and lost so much, and let him cry. The episode never aired as a traditional Family Feud game. Instead, it became a special hour-long program about veteran mental health, PTSD, survivor's guilt, and suicide prevention. The Morrison family's segment was combined with interviews with mental health professionals, other veterans sharing their stories, and resources for people struggling with similar issues. When the special episode aired 3 months later, the response was overwhelming. The Veterans Crisis Line reported a 400% increase in calls in the week following the broadcast. Thousands of veterans came forward to share their own experiences with survivor's guilt and PTSD. Families of suicide victims reached out to say that Jake's story helped them understand the guilt they had been carrying. But perhaps most impactful were the veterans who credited Jake's honesty with saving their lives. Letters poured in from service members who had been considering suicide but reached out for help after watching Jake's story. One Marine wrote, "I was planning to take my life the night that episode aired, but watching Captain Morrison break down and talk about his guilt, hearing Steve Harvey say that survivor's guilt is lying to us, something shifted. I called the crisis line instead. I'm getting help now." Jake Morrison saved my life by being brave enough to share his story. 6 months after the episode, Jake Morrison was doing intensive therapy specifically designed for combat veterans with PTSD and survivor's guilt. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and dark days, but slowly, with professional help and the support of his family, Jake began to heal. He started speaking publicly about his experience, partnering with organizations that focused on veteran mental health and suicide prevention. He shared Tommy's story and Rodriguez's story, not to wallow in guilt, but to help others recognize the signs of someone in crisis and to encourage veterans to seek help before they reached a breaking point. Jake also connected with Tommy's family and Rodriguez's mother, sharing his guilt with them and hearing directly from them that they didn't blame him. Tommy's sister told him, "Tommy struggled with depression long before your deployment. You were his best friend, not his therapist. You couldn't have saved him because he needed professional help that none of us knew how to get him." Rodriguez's mother told him, "You stayed with my son when he was dying. You didn't leave him alone. You gave him comfort. That's all a mother could ask for. Thank you for being there for him." 1 year after the Family Feud appearance, Jake returned to the show for a follow-up episode. The change was remarkable. While he still carried the weight of his experiences, he was no longer drowning in guilt. He had learned to honor Tommy and Rodriguez through living well rather than through suffering. "Steve," Jake said during the follow-up, "what you did that day, stopping everything and letting me share my story, that was the beginning of my healing. I had been carrying that guilt in silence for 7 years, convinced that I didn't deserve to talk about it, that I didn't deserve help. You gave me permission to be broken and to seek healing. You probably saved my life." He continued, "I still think about Tommy every day. I still think about Rodriguez. But now, instead of torturing myself with what-ifs, I try to honor them. I volunteer with suicide prevention organizations. I mentor young Marines and teach them about mental health. I'm open with my own struggles so other veterans know they're not alone. That's how I keep my promise to Tommy and Rodriguez now, by trying to prevent other families from experiencing what their families went through." Rachel spoke about the impact on their marriage. "For 7 years, I watched my husband suffer in silence, punishing himself for things he couldn't control. It was destroying our marriage because he couldn't let me in, couldn't let himself be vulnerable. But after that Family Feud episode, after he finally shared his burden publicly, he started to heal. We started to heal. We're expecting our first child now, and Jake is finally allowing himself to be excited about the future instead of trapped in the past. Steve Harvey reflected on the experience in his own interview. In all my years in television, I've had a lot of emotional moments. But Jake Morrison's story hit me differently. Here was a young man who had served his country with honor, who had done everything right, and he was being destroyed by guilt for things that weren't his fault. It made me realize how many people are out there carrying similar burdens, punishing themselves for being human, for not being able to save everyone. He continued, and it made me understand the hidden costs of war. We see the physical casualties, but we don't always see the psychological ones. We don't see the 22 veterans a day who die by suicide. We don't see the thousands struggling with PTSD and survivor's guilt. Jake's courage in sharing his story shined a light on those hidden costs, and I hope it made a difference. 5 years after the episode, Jake Morrison had retired from active duty and was working full-time with a veterans' mental health organization. He had become one of the leading voices on combat-related PTSD and survivor's guilt, speaking at military bases, veterans' hospitals, and congressional hearings about the need for better mental health support for service members. He had also established the Tommy Chen and Carlos Rodriguez Memorial Fund, which provided mental health services to veterans and suicide prevention resources to schools. The fund had helped thousands of people get the help they needed, creating a living legacy for the 2 young men whose deaths had shaped Jake's life. In an interview on the 5th anniversary of his Family Feud appearance, Jake reflected on his journey. I used to think that honoring Tommy and Rodriguez meant carrying their deaths as a burden I deserved. I thought suffering was how I showed respect for their lives. But I've learned that the best way to honor them is to make sure others don't experience what they did, to help veterans get mental health support before they reach crisis, to teach people to recognize the signs of suicide risk, to create a world where fewer families have to bury their loved ones to preventable deaths. He continued, I'll always wish I had called Tommy back. I'll always wish Rodriguez had survived. But I've stopped punishing myself for not being able to see the future or control the uncontrollable. Instead, I'm focused on what I can control, how I show up for people who are struggling now, how I use my platform to advocate for better mental health care, and how I honor the memory of those I've lost by helping prevent future losses.